to stop the invasion of our borders. We're going to reclaim our wealth. We're going to unlock the liquid gold that's right under our feet, liquid gold. And we are going to make America great again.
The US is seeing a dramatic surge in revenue from custom duties, nearly $30 billion in August 2025, the first full month under President Trump's new reciprocal tariff regime. Let's break it down and see how exactly is this new policy going to function, how big the revenues are, who's paying, and what this means for the US economy.
Focus on business today is from America, and the US Treasury has reported a major jump in customs duty collections for June, pushing total gross tariff revenue past $100 billion in the current fiscal year, a first in American history.
It began as a show of strength, another thunderous promise from Donald Trump, standing before a cheering crowd, claiming that billions were pouring back into America. "No one takes advantage of us anymore," he shouted, under the banner of America First. But behind the applause and the slogans, something far more fragile was forming, a web of resentment, anxiety, and retreat among the very allies Washington once relied on. What was sold as a $900 billion revival plan is now collapsing under its own weight. Because Japan and South Korea, two of America's most loyal and strategically vital partners, have just said no. They've rejected Trump's demand for massive new investments, and in doing so, they've sent a message louder than any tariff announcement. America's word no longer guarantees trust. At the heart of this standoff lies the Trump administration's newest ultimatum, a policy that demanded that U.S. allies reinvest nearly $900 billion into American manufacturing in exchange for tariff relief on cars, electronics, and steel. Tokyo and Seoul were the first to receive the pitch, and both turned away. Japanese officials called it economic coercion disguised as negotiation. Korean newspapers used a sharper word, blackmail. And that's where the unraveling began. Because Japan and Korea aren't just trade partners, they are the backbone of America's Indo-Pacific strategy, the anchor points that make U.S. power in Asia possible. But by turning economic policy into a ransom note, Trump has managed to erode the very trust that kept that system intact. In Tokyo, the pushback was swift. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida held an emergency meeting at the Diet, warning that trade must never be used as political extortion. Japanese automakers from Toyota to Nissan froze new U.S. plant expansions and quietly began redirecting their investment pipelines towards Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. It was a pivot driven by fear, but also by calculation. Why bet on an unstable partner? Across the sea, in Seoul, the anger ran even deeper. The fallout from the Georgia immigration raid, where over 300 Korean workers were detained under suspicion of labor violations, had already poisoned the mood. But the White House's $900 billion investment pledge demand turned tension into defiance. President Yoon's office released a thinly veiled rebuke. Korea's economy will not be a bargaining chip. Within weeks, Hyundai confirmed it was postponing its $5 billion EV expansion project in Georgia. The message was clear: no more blank checks. For decades, Japan and Korea accepted Washington's leadership because it offered predictability, protection, and mutual growth. But tariffs have changed that psychology. Under Trump's new model, every relationship is transactional. Every ally must pay tribute to prove loyalty. And that kind of diplomacy doesn't build alliances, it breaks them. The irony is that this was supposed to be the moment when America reasserted control over global trade. Tariffs were meant to draw factories back, rebuild the Midwest, and punish what Trump called free riders. Yet, in practice, they've produced the opposite effect: a patchwork of diplomatic crises, factory freezes, and rival economies thriving in the vacuum. The evidence is visible everywhere. In the Great Lakes, where governors once cheered the return of auto jobs, they now face layoffs and price shocks. Truck tariffs set at 25% are raising costs for fleets and small logistics firms across Michigan and Ohio. Canadian suppliers are absorbing those contracts. In Quebec and Ontario, new plants are opening with foreign investment redirected from shuttered U.S. projects. And in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney is seizing the moment. In press conferences, he's calm, almost surgical. Canada, he says, believes in cooperation over coercion. Behind those words is a diplomatic strategy that quietly undercuts Washington's leverage, building deeper ties with Japan, Korea, and Indonesia through new trade pacts. The Canada-Indonesia CEPA, signed in late September 2025, eliminates tariffs on over 95% of goods. That's more than just policy. It's proof that global trade is rebalancing, without the United States at its center. Even Mexico is hedging. After 2 years of tariff volatility, Mexican exporters have doubled shipments to Europe and South America. Diversify or die, one industry leader said on Bloomberg. And while Trump tweets about economic loyalty, the rest of North America is quietly rewriting the rules of its own economy. The backlash isn't just diplomatic, it's financial. The Japanese yen, once heavily pegged to US confidence, has started to decouple as Tokyo diversifies its reserves. Korean investment funds are redirecting liquidity toward ASEAN partnerships and Canada's mining and tech sectors. Meanwhile, the US Treasury faces the quiet consequence of its own pressure campaign, allies buying fewer treasuries and inflation creeping higher. Inside Washington, advisors remain divided. One senior economic aide insists, "These tariffs are leverage. We're forcing fair play." But that's a line even Wall Street no longer buys. Goldman Sachs' September report warns of long-term reputational risk among allied economies, noting that the perception of coercion may outweigh short-term fiscal gains. And perception, in diplomacy, is policy. Because once trust is broken, it cannot be restored with another deal or handshake. When Japan cancels a summit, or when Seoul recalls an ambassador, it's not just a snub. It's a signal to investors, multinationals, and smaller states. The US can no longer be relied upon to play by its own rules. At home, Americans are feeling the consequences in everyday life. Prices for electronics, televisions, chips, car parts, have jumped by nearly 18% since early summer. Small manufacturers dependent on imported components are folding under cost pressures. And farmers, once promised protection, now face fertilizer and machinery shortages as foreign suppliers turn to Canada and Europe. Trump's rhetoric, the America First, America Alone mantra, may sound defiant, but its outcomes have been anything but powerful. The more tariffs expand, the smaller the US market becomes. Allies adapt. Rivals fill the gaps. And within that vacuum, China and Canada find themselves stronger than before. In the middle of this storm, Mark Carney and Japan's economic minister quietly held a trilateral summit with South Korean trade officials. No Americans present. The meeting produced a symbolic but powerful declaration, a commitment to mutual resilience in supply chains. The subtext was unmistakable. Mutual resilience without Washington. This is how influence fades, not in war or collapse, but in slow withdrawal. As trust drains away, and former partners start building new systems to protect themselves. The White House may not see it yet, but the pivot has already begun. And looming ahead is the October 7th meeting between Trump and Carney, a meeting now seen as the last real chance to halt the spiral. Insiders say Trump intends to double down, pushing new conditions on Canada and Japan to balance commitments. But those close to Ottawa say Carney plans to counter with a coalition proposal, a North Pacific partnership linking Canada, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN under shared trade and security principles. If that happens, Washington could find itself isolated in the very region it once dominated. That's the paradox of coercion. It can make others stronger by forcing them to stand together. The $900 billion demand, once a symbol of strength, has become a monument to hubris. Japan and Korea's refusal marks not just a diplomatic embarrassment, but a historical turning point. The moment US allies stopped taking orders and started writing their own playbook. And the cost won't just be measured in lost contracts or factory closures. It will be measured in trust, the invisible currency that once powered America's global leadership. Because tariffs can buy time, They can even win votes. But they cannot buy faith. And faith, once gone, leaves only fear behind. As the world watches the October 7th meeting, one question now defines the entire debate. Will the United States finally choose cooperation, or keep mistaking isolation for strength? If this crisis has proven anything, it's that the old order is shifting. Allies are adapting, Canada is rising, and the White House, once the architect of global trade, now finds itself cornered, not by rivals, but by its own allies walking away. In Tokyo, senior ministers quietly admit what few dared say publicly. Japan no longer sees Washington as a predictable partner. For decades, the US-Japan alliance was anchored on trust, military security in exchange for economic alignment. But Trump's escalating tariff ultimatums have upended that balance. When the administration demanded a $450 billion increase in Japanese investment to level trade relations, Tokyo didn't just hesitate. It froze all new joint manufacturing proposals with US firms. Behind closed doors, Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda began redirecting their next-generation EV projects to domestic facilities and even Southeast Asia, away from US dependency. Meanwhile, in Seoul, the mood has shifted from cautious optimism to open defiance. South Korea's National Assembly has held emergency sessions questioning whether Washington's tariff strategy violates previous trade agreements. Hyundai, once celebrated by Trump as proof of foreign investment returning home, now finds itself caught in political crossfire. The U.S. raids on its Alabama and Georgia facilities, justified as compliance checks, have been viewed in Seoul as acts of humiliation. Within weeks, Korean officials announced a plan to move over $12 billion in battery component production back to Busan and Incheon, citing political unpredictability in the U.S. market. This isn't just corporate repositioning, it's geopolitical rebalancing. Japan and South Korea, two of America's closest Pacific allies, are forging closer coordination not under U.S. leadership, but independently and increasingly with Canada, Australia, and even parts of Europe. When Japanese and Korean finance ministers met in Vancouver last month alongside Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, it wasn't a routine discussion. It was a signal. The meeting resulted in a framework for a Pacific Supply Chain Resilience Pact, aiming to reduce exposure to U.S. tariffs and political shocks. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to subscribe to Traveling Vibes, where we break down global shifts shaping our world, one story at a time. Your support keeps independent analysis alive. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, in geopolitics, trust is the real currency of power.